Okay, so at this point, we have our to-dos. We can add, we can delete, and functionality is starting to come together. But we're starting to have a little bit of a maintenance problem here where it's not serious yet, but over time it could become more serious where we're starting to do some prop drilling. So for example, this delete to do is being passed through the to-do list, which doesn't actually use it on its own. It then in turn passes things down. So what I'd like to do here is refactor, and I'm going to refactor it into a context. Now, this is fairly straightforward, but there may be a better way to do this. This is the way that I am familiar with, so that's what I'm going to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file. Now, this one is not a component per se. I mean, it is, but I'm going to call this one a provider. So this is going to go under providers, to do provider.test.js. And here we're going to just I'm going to create my standard exists thing. So we're going to import to-dos provider from the local to-dos provider. And then we're going to describe it and expect that it exists, like in every other one that we've done so far. So it exists. Expect type of use provider to be a function. And of course, this will fail because nothing exists yet. Right. Lovely. So let's come over here and make this test pass. We're going to create a file to do provider.js. And here we're going to create a function to provider and export it. Okay, so why didn't that work? That worked because I named it wrong. So to do provider, I named everything to do provider here. I'm going to just change this one. It's going to be to do provider all the way through here. Okay. Really? This one. Okay, and just saves us again. So now I have this component, obviously, it doesn't do anything. The question is, what do we want it to do? Well, what a provider generally does is it will wrap a component, and then it will allow us to access the values provided by the provider from inside that component. So fundamentally, what we want this to do is it provides a list of to-dos. That's among other things. I also am going to want this to do some other things here. So it will also provide an add function. And it also will provide a delete to do function. Okay, so we've got all of the things that we need to do mapped out over here. So it provides a list of to-dos. So what is that going to actually look like when we use this component? This component is going to basically have to take in children, right? So effectively, this is going to be children, which it's then going to return. This is not going to really be a div. This is going to wrap children though. Okay, so the thing that it's going to be is going to be an actual React context, which in order to get that, we need to import that. However, we don't have a failing test yet. And so I'm going to start by writing this failing test. And this test is a little bit more complicated than the ones that we've done so far, because I have to create a test component here. And this test component is going to be one of the children inside the context provider. And then we're going to test the methods based on the test component. So if in order to create a test component, I need actual React in here. We're going to import React. And now I'm going to create my test component. So const, I'm going to actually name it test component, and it's going to equal nothing special, but it's going to return a div. And within our div, we want a list of to-dos. So the to-dos have to come from somewhere, right? They're going to come from a custom hook that we haven't created yet, which is going to allow us to use the to-do context, which hasn't been exposed yet. So basically, it's going to be const to-dos is going to equal use to-dos, like this. Now, use to-dos is going to have to come from here. And because of that, I think it's probably better for me to first make sure that that exists. So here, I'm going to skip this test, and this should not fail at this point. Okay, so I'm going to make a new one. It exports a use to-dos function or custom hook. And here I'm going to do I'm just going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to expect type of use to-dos, spell type of correctly, to be a function. That test should pass because I did write it. Oh, maybe I did not. To-do provider, no, I didn't. Okay, so in here, I'm going to make a function of use to-dos, and we're going to export this as well. There we go. Okay, now we can continue with this test where this is going to take to-dos out of the use to-dos, and then it's going to map over them. So here we're going to say to-dos.map, and a to-do in here for each one. I'm just going to go to-do.id and to-do.task. So a very super simple test component. It's just going to make divs that have tasks in them. Okay, so that's our test component done. Now we need to actually use this thing. And in order to use it, I'm going to need to render it, but I need to render it inside the provider. So basically, I'm going to need to render, I'm going to say const UI equals render. And here, I'm going to render my to-do provider. And within my to-do provider here, I'm going to put my test component. Now, render I don't have, so let's go get that. We're going to import render screen so we can do the matching from testing library, React. Okay. And if this works correctly, which it cannot possibly work correctly at this point, then we will be able to say screen.get by text and our actual to-do. Now, we don't have a list of to-dos yet, so I'm going to make a test list of to-dos. Right? And it can happen anywhere before the render. So we'll const to-dos equals a list, and here we'll have an ID of 1, a task of test task, and a done of false. Okay, and now in this provider, we somehow have to get the to-dos in there and then pull them back out. Now, what's going to happen in reality is that the to-dos are going to come from state. I want to be able to mock them out here for ease of testing. So I'm going to sort of fake it here. And here we're just going to say get by text to-dos, the first element dot task, right? And we still have this problem of getting the to-dos inside the provider. So I'm going to give it a prop. I'm going to say to-dos equals to-dos, but I really don't want to do it like that. Instead, I'm going to say values equals to-dos. And the reason why will become a little bit more clear later. Basically, I'm trying to do a dependency injection here so that later on we can run both testing and production at the same time. Okay. So here I've got values, and obviously all this is going to fail. Nothing returned from render in here. So what I need to return in here, like I said before, is a div. It's not a div, it's a provider that's going to wrap the children, right? So we know that children has to be in here, and I'm sending in a thing called values, which is my dependency injection. So the provider itself has to come from, we're going to need React because to-do provider is going to be a React component. Okay, so we have to create a context now. So const to-do context equals React create context. And this context gives us the provider. So here I can say return the to-do context dot provider, and it wraps the children. Now, this in and of itself is not good enough because the value prop is required. So here I'm going to say value equals, and I'm going to be returning an empty object. And some of the keys on this object are going to be the to-dos themselves, the add to-do function, the edit to-do function, the delete to-do function. But here, so we're passing in a to-do, to-dos list rather. So I know that the key is to-dos. And what I'm going to say is, if we got one, and this only happens in testing, but if we do, then we want to prefer that one. Otherwise, we're going to use a real one, which is going to come from state. So to-dos doesn't exist yet, so we have to import state now. So use state. So here I'm going to have const to-dos. Well, this is an array. To-dos and set to-dos is going to equal use state empty array. And so now this test still won't pass because we're not actually using it. I'm using the use to-dos hook inside of my test component, and it doesn't actually do anything. And what I need this to do is use another hook from React, use context to return the to-do context. And use context is not here. We have to import that as well. Okay, so now what do we have? Unable to find an element with this. And what is the reason? I do not know the reason. What we got back was all this. To do dot task, to do's dot map. We are getting an empty array. And why are we getting an empty array? So dot log values. We should not be getting an empty array here. Values.todos is undefined. Oh, that's because this needs to have one more set of brackets. There you go. Okay, I apologize for that little bug. Okay, so we can get rid of these console logs. And now that we have everything set up here, we can go ahead and implement the other ones. So this actually has now moved all of the to-dos that used to be here in app. We've basically now migrated this piece out. Now I need to migrate these other pieces out. So it has an add to do function. Okay. For this one, I have to do something similar, but not actually as complicated. So what we're going to do here is create another test component. And we're going to do the same thing where we destructure something out of the context. Add to do this time equals use to do's. And this time we can actually return null. We don't have to go through all that stuff because there's nothing in the sort of UI that we care about. What we care about now is that the add to do function got called at all. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just call it. And I'm going to call it with a test task. Now, in reality, the new task is only going to have a task on it. This is going to be task and test task. Because our software is going to actually just create an ID and set done to false by default. So new task here. And with that, obviously this is going to, this should fail. Oh, it doesn't fail because I didn't do any assertions. So with this, we have the makings of what we need. So in order for this to work, we need to render again. I'm just going to copy all this here. This time, the values, instead of to-dos, this is going to be add to do. Now, add to do, since I want to assert against it, I'm going to turn it into a mock function. So I'm going to say const or function, no, const is good, add to do equals jest.mock function. And then down here, after it's been rendered, because we called it here on line 35, I can assert against it. I'm going to expect add to do to have been called times 1. And I'm going to expect add to do to have been called with new task. Now it should fail. Okay, good. Add to do is not a function. And of course, that's because we haven't brought it in at all yet here, right? in here, in order to get it, we need to actually bring a function in. And so we're going to make a function, add to do, and we're going to just add it here. Actually, we don't even need, yeah, I do need that. So values dot add to do, then again, we're going to prefer this one, which will only be true in testing. Otherwise, we're going to do this in, we're going to do this one in production. And now our test passes. So now we have to do another one. Now here's the thing, this is starting to get very repetitive, right? These are very nearly the same. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract a function here and just create like my own custom render function. So I'm going to say function custom render. It's just going to take in the component to render, which is going to be our test component each time, and props. And here I'm going to return render. What we're going to render is the to-do provider, the values equal to props. And we're going to render the component ourselves here. Okay. Okay. So with that, now I can replace these with a custom render call. So I can say here custom render, and my component is test component. And the props that I want to send here is to-dos. Right? And this should still function. And it does. So now I can do this one. So I'm going to say custom render test component. And here I'm going to ship add to do. Get rid of this one. And we're good. So now we can add the delete function. So from here, we're going to first make a failing test. And this one is pretty much the same, almost the same exact thing as the add function. So I'm just going to copy it pretty much the whole way. The only thing I'm going to do differently here is the task itself is not a new task, it's just task. And I'm going to give it the full thing, even though it really doesn't need it in this test. In my mind, this makes for a better test. And this is going to be task. This is delete to do. This is delete to do. And this is task. And this is delete to do. And this has to be delete to do. Of course, these need to be delete to do. Okay, so delete to do is not a function. We know that. We need to bring it in over here. So here we're going to have function delete to do, and we're going to add it up on our thing here. So delete to do values dot delete to do. Again, preferring it for the tests. Otherwise, by default, we're going to just have delete to do up there. Okay. Now, my preference is to alphabetize things, so that's what I'm going to do here. And all of our tests are now passing. That's great, except that they don't really work. So what I'm going to do now is, all we've actually tested is that this provider actually exports all this stuff. So when I actually migrate everything out of here now, we're going to see that nothing's going to work. So this add to do function, I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to replace my dummy one in the other one. So I'm going to cut it from here, get the whole thing. Actually, I'll take both of them at once. I'm going to cut these from here, and I'm going to put them inside here. And then I'm also going to remove all of the state stuff here. We don't need the state anymore. And now we need to import the use hook. So import use to do from providers to do provider. Now here I can say const add to do, delete to do, and to do's equals use to do. Now this is not working now because my app is not wrapped in the provider, right? So I have to actually import the provider. So to do provider and the rest of it, right? Now here we can wrap it. Doesn't matter if I go inside or outside of this div, but I'm going to go inside. So to do provider is going to wrap these guys. Now the problem is you can't use this whole use to do hook in here in the same file as this is defined like this. Because it's in the same component, this component is not wrapped, so this won't work. So instead I have to walk into each of these other components and import from there. So we'll start with the to-do form. And in here, I'm going to import the use hook. So import use to do from the provider. And in here, we're going to const add to do equals use to do, like so, right? Is it used to do or to do's? It's plural. So we need the plural. Okay. Now in here, instead of handle submit, I need to call add to do. And handle submit is no longer a thing here. Okay, now if we go back to the app, we can get rid of handle submit on this. And then in to-do list, we need to get the others. So we'll go to this definition. And the truth is that to-do list only needs the to-dos themselves. It doesn't actually need delete to-do. We can walk in there and fix that one there. So here we're going to import use to-dos from the context, or from the provider rather. Here we will say const to-dos equals use to-dos, run it. And still we're going to have problems. This is no longer necessary. None of this is necessary anymore, which means we can clean up the entire call signature here. And delete to do doesn't exist here anymore. So we have to go into this one now and import it here too. So in here now, we're going to import use to do's from the provider. and handle delete now. Well, we'll go spot by spot here. The truth is we may not need it in here at all. Oh yes, of course we do, because it has to happen here. So we'll say const delete to do equals use to do's. Over here, we can get rid of this one now. And now we get rid of all of this. And what is wrong with our app now? It is too much to see. It's saying on line 9, but I actually can't see what the problem is. And so because I can't, I'm going to try and switch this now to only run the app tests, I think. Let's see if we can see what actually went wrong. There we go. What do we have? Cannot read properties of undefined at reading add to do. Oh, okay. So in this case, I didn't provide values. And so because I didn't provide values, this is all crashing here. I can use optional chaining here to fix this whole problem. There we go. Okay. So the issue was that it was trying to destructure, it was trying to access a property on undefined, and that's not a thing. Okay, so our application is now a lot cleaner, in my mind anyway. There's no more passing down of all these props, and I think we're ready for a commit. So let's do that. So git add all, git commit -m refactor into. All right, in the next video, we will implement the edit behavior.